Let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to come together. We ask you to be amongst us and be in our presence. You are the healer, the comforter, the refuge, the strength that we need as we grieve during these difficult times, especially near the holidays, where we just are always missing our loved ones. So we ask you to be with us this evening and give us the words that will be helpful to all who are listening. You know the pain, you know the challenges that each person in this room is dealing with. So we just ask you to give us that food that we need to strengthen us to continue this journey. We ask these things in your name, Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Okay, well, I am privileged to be with you tonight, both in the coffee house and those of you who are joining us on live stream. So my name is Sandy Danek, and I have been the coordinator and facilitator of the Healing Hearts Grief Program through the Catholic Church for, I hate to say how many years, but more than 30. I was just a baby when it was all happening. And so we have different areas of the program, but predominantly twice a year, we have a 6-week series, a program of 6 weeks where we basically go through all the steps of grief. And it's anywhere from 12 to 15 people, sometimes can be more than that, and go through the different aspects of grief. My belief is the more we know about the grief process and what we're dealing with, the better opportunity that we have to manage it and to find ways to cope. So one of our goals is to offer both education about the grief process and coping skills that you can acquire that may help you manage your grief differently. Unfortunately, well, grief is a lot of work. It's hard work. And it is something that doesn't leave us ever completely. Most people will say that it is life-changing. So it doesn't matter what the grief experience can be. Certainly those who have lost their spouses, even parents, siblings, any sort of death experience that you have is really life-changing for you because it's your personal, intimate experience. So your grief is yours. And even if you're with somebody who's had a similar loss, you're going to grieve differently. You're going to have different issues. And so the important aspect of supporting one who's grieving is to validate whatever those feelings are. So some of us have this idea on where the grief journey goes. You know, is it like that denial, anger, sadness, depression? There is no exact recipe for grief. Each of us grieve very differently. And we all have different issues that we're dealing with. The important thing to realize is that what you are experiencing most likely is normal. A lot of people can feel like they're just going crazy because it's so intense, it's so powerful. But if you understand the issues and then find those ways to help you cope with it, that's a big part of it. It's intense though. And as I said, it's a lot of work. There's a lot of emotion dealing with it. So you think about when your loved one passed and you had to go through the funeral and all of the firsts, even going through, say, if your loved one was ill and the journey of their death, whether they were in the hospital, hospice, all of that was so intense and stays with you. Even in some cases, it can be traumatizing as you watch this person that you knew, continue to fall short of life and coming into the death experience. So all of that, and sudden death can be that also, where there's experiences associated with that can leave flashbacks, traumatizing us in a way that we are just living it over and over and over again. But the good news about processing that is the more you talk about it, the more you share your experiences, the more you share your trauma or your stress with that, the more you are processing it and having an ability then to find a way to cope with it. So living it over and over again necessarily isn't a bad idea, and it will likely be that in time you will move beyond that. So I'm just going to talk about some general areas of grief first, and then I will move into the areas of the holiday, because I think it's important that we talk about just the high points of what's necessary to understand grief. So, as I said, we grieve very differently, very individually, very personally, but there's also no timetable to grief. So, you know how culture is with somebody who's had a loss, right? There's like this onslaught of all this attention that you get or support that you get either during the illness and the pending death, and then directly after the death. And it's almost like everybody just disappears within weeks. Then there's kind of this unwritten rule that somehow you're going to be needing to get beyond this, maybe in just months. Maybe if it's a spouse, they'll give you a year. And then, right, you just move on from it. But as I said earlier, the reality of this is that grief stays with us the remainder of our lives. And what we do with that is the important point, processing it in some way and finding a way to make it a part of our lives. Now, you can take grief and you can let it just sit and not do anything with it, or you can find opportunities to learn about it, manage it, and find those coping skills to deal with it. If you don't, grief will wait for you, and it just simply will not go away. And that's why some people later in life might have intense mental health issues, because they haven't really understood the necessity of doing the hard work of grief. And I'll give you just a small example. So many years ago, my husband and I lost a baby during our 5th month of pregnancy. And I was so caught up with the time that had happened over why and what the medical aspects of it were. I was even working at Bryan Hospital at the time, and I'd spend my lunch hours going into the medical library, and I would research every element of it. Why is this happening? What went wrong? What could I have done to make it better? So then later, when unfortunately I had the same experience of losing a child in my 2nd trimester, I began to grieve that loss. And then as I was grieving it, it was so intense. It was so difficult. And then one day I was in front of the tabernacle and I was praying, and I had this overwhelming surge that I had not done anything to grieve the death of that first child. I hadn't named that child. I didn't even acknowledge my baby. I was so caught up with how the doctor treated me, how the hospital did this or that, how there were these oddities that nobody could define, that I totally lost sight of the fact that I had lost a child. So then I felt like now I'm grieving the death of 2 babies. However, it did give me the opportunity to name that baby, acknowledge that baby, and process the grief of that loss as well, getting outside of the circumstances of the death and more realizing that the little life that I lost had great significance to our marriage and our family. So just an example of that. There are a multitude of emotions. And as I said, there's no timetable to it. So for instance, if you take our grief program, which Joan has, and you have as well, right? You remind me your first name. Janice, that's right. Janice has as well. So you can attest that when we're in our groups, and it's Tuesday nights, usually in the spring and the fall, and it's 7 to 9, and you can know that somewhere throughout the night we're going to have all these different emotions, right? People are going to be crying, maybe some people even angry, discouraged, laughter. I remember years ago we had somebody in the group and we just had all these emotions going, and she was so angry that we were laughing, because how could you laugh over something so serious? But here's the thing about laughter in a grieving experience, right? You cannot grieve 24/7. It is not humanly possible to grieve 24/7. And it does not mean that if you are grieving for this person and you take breaks away from it, or you have times of laughter or times of enjoyment, doesn't mean that you're minimizing or demoralizing the person who has died. It just simply means we cannot grieve 24/7. It's too intense for that. So there's a myriad of all these emotions that are happening, and sometimes can be happening in the same setting where you're moving from one emotion to another and it's all over the map. And that's kind of what grief is. I call it the roller coaster effect. So, just when you think things are going well and you're climbing up that roller coaster, and then you maybe get to the top and you think, I think I'm doing better. And then something happens unexpected and you can easily crash again. Doesn't mean that you're not healing or that you're not moving in a good direction. It just means that's just the experience of grief. That's how grief works. That's why there's times where we're going along and we'll have these experiences where something totally unexpected happens and you're in this deep, intense area of grief, and that wasn't what you were planning for. It wasn't what you were thinking, but that's what happens because it's so unpredictable. So loneliness can be a factor for many, and it doesn't necessarily mean in a relationship, a spousal relationship. It could mean your parents, just wanting to hear their voice one more time, wanting to see them, be with them. You're reminded at every turn of their presence, right? You go to the grocery store, you see something you would buy for them that they liked, and it's a reminder. Something in the house, something that's their clothing or their smell, or any sort of signifier that gives you a reminder of their presence can create that loneliness and that longing to be with them again. And that's a real emotion that can be very powerful. And a lot of that comes from just that uncertainty. Why? How does death happen? And what are we to do with it? I think it's only been in the last 25 to 30 years that we've really talked about it seriously. So those of you that are in my age category, so maybe that 50 to 70 age group, can speak to how maybe when we were even children, that death was just not talked about. And if it was talked about, it was talked about in very skirted ways. So example I can give you of that is when I was just a little girl, I was probably 9 or 10 years old. And I had this grandfather that was from Germany. And so he spoke very little English, but I loved him. I don't know why. He just this little guy with a full mustache, and all the other children were scared of him, but not me. I just loved him and crawl up in his lap and give him hugs, and just he meant a great deal to me. And so even though we couldn't even communicate very well because of his lack of English, there was just a connection there. Well, he died. And so I remember when they talked about the fact that Grandpa had died, and I had this terrible yearning to be with him. And I wanted to see him. And oh no, that wasn't permissible. We are not going to do that. And well, can I go to the funeral? Oh, no. So it was just, he was there one day and then he wasn't. And there was no discussion about it because we had in our minds at that time that if we just didn't talk about it, then it wouldn't be painful, right? It wouldn't be hurtful when indeed it is. Fortunately, we've moved beyond that some. And with children, we let them write letters. We let them draw pictures, perhaps, take a favorite toy and put it in the casket with Grandpa. We are doing better at making strides to teach children that grief is a necessary experience in our lives, and we just simply need to find a way to deal with it, right? So, grief can be exhausting. It can be overwhelming at times. And that's why I think it's important to have this talk, this information during the holiday. So we're just coming out of Thanksgiving, and perhaps you spent some time with family, and that could have been a good experience or not. But then now we're in the Advent season, we're anticipating Christmas, and there's all kinds of emotions that come with the Christmas spirit, right? So, okay, moving out of COVID, some people say not, but for the most part, yes. But stay tuned because it could all change again, right? So that COVID experience of isolation, of fear, of the unknown, is kind of a replicate of what grief is, isn't it? It's the fear, the unknown, the uncertainty. Where's it going to go? Where am I going to be at in a couple more years? Am I ever going to feel I'm beyond this? You see kind of the connection between the COVID experience and the grief experience is just the uncertainty. We don't know where we're going. So that, I think that's what makes this difficult. And those, unfortunately, who are around us don't quite know what to deal with, how to deal with that. They're not always certain how to support us in that experience because so people who are with you, who love you, who have a connection with you, it could be your family, friends, coworkers, church associates, whoever it is in your life that you're interacting with, they have regard for you, love for you, appreciation for you, for who you have been. So now you've got this grief experience that is very difficult to deal with, life-changing. Maybe you'll never be the same person again. Probably you won't. Not that that's a bad thing. That can put you in a whole different world of compassionate, caring, merciful person that maybe you weren't before the death. But it definitely is life-changing. Okay, so that person that's in your life just wants you to be the way you were before. So it's not that they're uncaring of what you're going through. It's not that they're not sensitive to it. They just want you to be the way that you were before. And unfortunately, we are never going to be that way again. So, okay, how does that apply to us in the holiday season? Well, it's because we're going to be with family. We're buying gifts. We're getting ready with food, all these the elements of Christmas and coming up to it. And we're expected to perform, so to speak, and making certain that we are there, supplying all those Christmas needs. If you've got children, grandchildren, loved ones that you have been responsible for, preparing the food, buying the gifts, decorating the house or whatever, all those expectations are there. But here's the problem. All that shopping and wrapping and writing Christmas cards and the things that's normal, we don't feel like we want to do this year because we're too weighed down with the loss of this person. And those around us who have seen us in a normal capacity just want us to, if you just get into it again, if you just grab the holidays and embrace them and enjoy all the things about Christmas, it'll make you feel better. They don't necessarily understand how there's a fear associated with these things that come about, because not only do we have to get through Thanksgiving, now we got to get through Christmas. There's all these other things that happen thereafter, like weddings and other family gatherings, anniversaries, and then those dreaded future funerals of people that we may be expected to go and pay our respects to. All of those things are very challenging, but baby steps that if we take those baby steps, it gets us further down the road, but still challenging. And that doesn't happen, that fear doesn't go away overnight, right? So what's happening to us is that we've lost the norms that we've been experiencing in our life. Everything that we may have had before this loved one has passed away has now changed. So all those norms that we might have experienced prior to the death have all been turned upside down and are different. So how do we identify what are the things that we can enjoy coming out of this? Can we still socialize? Can we still be with family? Can we go out to dinner? Can we go to a concert? Go to a friend's home and experience all these things when we feel like we don't want to function, let alone go to these celebratory things, right? Where it makes us feel like we're supposed to just be a part of the group and we don't feel like we want to be. So the stress that comes from that, coupled with, okay, we moved out of COVID. Now we're in a place in our country where we're experiencing some of the most stressful, challenging times many of us have ever seen, right? So inflation issues and political issues and, whatever political ideas that are on your mind or national challenges that are on your mind that brings about stress, then just adds to the stress that you're already experiencing. So, the COVID thing kind of overshadowed our grief before. Now we've got the national things that are weighing on us, and everything's costing more. Christmas dinner's costing more, Christmas presents are costing more. All of these things are kind of intertwining with the grief experience that we are suffering. So how do you deal with that? Well, one, you have to make a decision that you have to be patient with yourself. So we know that grief exists. We know that it's something we have to find a way to deal with. And then we have to be patient with ourselves to say, I've got to do something about this and I've got to work on this. So part of that patience means I maybe need to be aware that I'm only going to be about 50 to 75% of what I'm capable of. Otherwise, I'm not going to be myself right now. Maybe my memory is off. Maybe my ability to do things, concentrate, focus is off because I'm so overwhelmed with the emotions that I'm dealing with this grief. It's difficult for me to function in the same way that I used to. So patience is really what is needed. But patience with those who are around you to support you and what you need. Okay, so how are you going to let people know what you need? You've got to communicate it as best you can. So there are going to be circumstances where you're going to be going through something that's difficult and you don't know what's going on completely. You're feeling sad, overwhelmed, stressed a little bit. And somebody says to you, so what's wrong? What are you feeling like today? And maybe you can't even identify that. You can't even say, I don't know. I just know I'm feeling this way, but I don't know why. I mean, don't you have those emotions sometimes? I just don't know why I'm feeling that way. So most of the time, though, you're going to know. So to keep it to yourself isn't helpful to those who are around you, right? So this is the best laid plan that you can have for getting through the holidays is to make a plan, is to have a plan that says, how am I going to deal with this? Okay, first off, where am I going to go? Am I going to stay in the same traditions that I've always had? Or will I do something totally and completely different? Sometimes in our groups, we've had people that will just go off, maybe even by themselves, or go on a trip or something instead of doing the traditional family gathers at the house. We set the table and nobody talks about what's happening because, well, if we bring it up, it could bring emotions and sadness. And, oh, nobody's supposed to be sad at Christmas, right? We're all supposed to be, celebration, good times. But the elephant in the room is there. This person has died and we are suffering that loss. So we've got to deal with it in some way. So the plan you need to make is, how am I going to deal with this? Am I going to do the same things that we've always done? Perhaps there are things that you can do that comfort you. And that could be, well, I'm kind of visualizing where my husband would sit. If he were not there any longer, perhaps nobody else would sit there. Maybe I would put a candle there, or maybe I would have some sort of visual that we would take note that he would not be there. And what would we would then do about that? Acknowledge it, feel the freedom to talk about it and feel the freedom to express what is helpful for you to get through this. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to open yourself up to the whole room. It could be maybe you have an advocate. Perhaps you have someone that you trust that knows you well, perhaps knows some of what you're going through, that you say, okay, they're going to be there at the event with you. And you say, hey, look, I need a plan. Let's say I'm at this Christmas celebration and I can't deal with it because it is just too much for me to manage right now. So that person is your advocate to either help you out of a situation that you're in with someone you're talking to, or a plan to let you escape altogether. There is nothing wrong with being in an event and you're grieving and you can't deal with it to say, I'm out of here. And it's like I tell people if they have to go to a funeral after their loved one has died and they have anxiety about going to that funeral, sit in the back. Then if you feel like I can't get through this, leave. Nobody's going to notice you leaving if you're sitting in the back. Now if it's another family member, and you have to sit up front, that could be a bit different. But map out a plan that's going to help you in the experience so that if you find you're in a circumstance you don't think you can deal with, then turn to that advocate. Make a decision to say, you know what? I don't feel well. I got to leave. It's okay. We don't have to perform for everybody else. What we have to do is find those coping mechanisms for us to get through some of the challenges that we might have before us during the holiday season. The expectations that we place on ourselves can be sometimes the highest stressor. Because, we always have these ideas, and women are probably worse at this than men. But, we want to nurture everybody in the room. We want to make sure everybody has the food they want and that it's very good. Everybody has the gifts they want and they're going to really like them. Everything looks perfectly decorated. We always have these high expectations that we place on ourselves that in normal circumstances make it difficult. Now you add on the stress of the grief experience that you're having, and it makes it all the more difficult. So achieving those reasonable expectations can help lessen a bit of the stress too. Anybody have questions or comments they want to make? I know we'll have like a Q&A at the end, but I always think when somebody's talking and I have a question or a comment, and then they just go on to the next point, by the time the talk is over, I don't remember what my question or comment was. So if you want to interrupt, raise your hand, whatever, feel free to do so. So crying. So crying for many of us is a normal response to pain. And I have to say that probably when I started doing this grief work more than 30 years ago, we didn't see men so much come to our groups. Now it is more than common that men are in our group. Always we have men in our groups. And I would have said that probably in the beginning, men were a little bit more cautious about how they would share their emotions or their feelings. Now it's normal. When you say, ladies, being in the group, that you say the men in our group were comfortable sharing. So one of the things we do when we start our groups is we talk about the confidentiality. We talk about the importance of people feeling comfortable and free to share whatever personal emotions that they are experiencing. So definitely that crying element can be important, not for everyone, but for many. So there should be no inhibition to share that emotion when it's a genuine need to cry. So say you're in a family situation and it's Christmas Day, and this is just very emotional for you because you're feeling the loss of the person that you've spent your Christmases with before. So you feel like tears are coming on or whatever emotion that you're having at that moment. You should just experience it. If it means you leave the room to do it, then do that. Because it's important for you to have that experience. Now, not in all cases can you. I always think about this one teacher we had in the group. She lost her husband. She was a fairly younger woman. He died of a disease that, far too young. And she was a teacher. And so she would always speak about how she was in the environment with the kids where she felt emotional and wanted to be able to have that emotion and cry, but she couldn't because she had all these little kids she had to care for. So sometimes she would say, I'm going to make copies. I'll be back in a moment. And, she would have her little 2 or 3 minute meltdown and then come back in the room and start all over again. Trying to find ways to release that emotion is so very important because it's not healthy to keep it in, right? It's not healthy for us to just hold that all in. I think what's important is that we just find what we need to do to express our grief and then have an expectation of those around us that we are respected for what we feel and what we need to do. That, this emotion is something that we honor because it's a necessary journey that we have to go through when we've lost someone that we love. And that's very important to us. It just in the group, we talk about the necessity of respecting everybody's emotions, everybody's experience, no matter what it is. So when you're in a setting where you're with people that have had similar losses, you can have a lot of things that you can relate to each other over, but you can also have different issues altogether. And so one of the reasons I think that when we have our gatherings, and people are talking, and we have a format where the first part of the evening is education. The second part is we share our experiences, our emotions, our thoughts on closely to what the topic is. And I always say that there is no magical remedy for what we can do to provide support to people who are grieving. I wish I had that magical wand where I could make it better for people. And unfortunately, there's no one thing you can do for someone, but you can listen. You can listen and you can care, and you can share your own experiences, perhaps with that person that has died, but validating the feelings of someone who is grieving is critical. And just because we're in the holidays doesn't mean that we put that aside so that everybody can just have the perfect Hallmark experience of Christmas. You know, these things are necessary for our mental health and for our experience that we're going through. So, you know, by all means, you know, seeing where those difficulties lie and then trying to find the best laid plans to help us through that. Some of it can be to creating memories. Like on my Christmas tree, I have ornaments with my baby's names on them, and they get hung on the tree every year, and my kids have grown up with that. And the holidays, we go to the gravesite and we take flowers. The kids used to, when they were littler, take toys. And my babies are in Babyland, and so we go around and look at all the other things that people had brought. If it's in the summertime, maybe we'd water plants or we'd pick up trash or whatever. It was kind of just like an experience for us to be in the midst of our babies and just have that family time together. Maybe we'd sit on the bench and pray, you know, just have that ability to just come together and offer those memories and those experiences of respect, you know, paying our respect. So maybe it's to take at Christmas time a wreath to the gravesite or giving a memorial in your loved one's name. You know, I think sometimes just making that donation and saying this is in honor of my loved one can be nice. It's important that we also realize that by participating in these things, even though we may not feel like participating in them, gives us an ability then to get outside ourselves and not to become so isolated. So I think one of the serious consequences that we suffered with the COVID experience is that many of us in our community became isolated. And albeit it was forced on us in the beginning, that isolation, but we haven't come completely out of that yet. Even though we say, well, we're kind of out of the COVID period, even though it still looms over us at times and threats of it still exist. We haven't quite moved back into a normal pattern that we would have been prior to COVID. So what that's done is it's caused a lot of isolation, and grief can be isolating. So you could be in an experience where somebody says, hey, let's go out to dinner, or hey, how about we do this or that? And I don't feel like it, but thanks anyway. I think I'll opt out. So that isolation can become very real and very serious. And I think we're in a culture where we're having a serious epidemic of that, going beyond the grief experience, but just the remnants of COVID, where we created all this isolation. And then that just adds to the stress of your grief experience too. So with that, you know, consider going outside of yourself and doing things that you maybe wouldn't think that you're capable of doing. At least give it a try. Like I said, sit in the back of the room, you know, go to an area of the room where you're a little bit more comfortable, and maybe you'll start entering more and more into the experience. And you might walk away feeling as though I was really glad I had that experience and made the decision to do this, rather than say, I just can't do it. So with your loved ones, as I said, making a plan might be to say, these are where my needs are. This is what I think would be helpful for me. Most people will want to support us. They just don't know how. So as we've gone through the grieving process, we probably could all point to somewhere, something that somebody has said to us that was like really off the wall. Like, I can't believe you just said, like, they're trying to find ways to comfort you, but what they're saying is not at all helpful or even hurtful. Like, well, at least they're not suffering anymore. Well, you can have more babies. Your baby might have been deformed. The hurtful things that come, well, they weren't around so much. Your dad traveled a lot, so you didn't really know him that well, right? And I'm not just making this up. I'm repeating things that I've heard that participants in our group will say. And I'm just and the baby comments were certainly poured over on me, especially in years past when we've learned a lot about grief. And so I think that's getting better, but still there's that thought of, well, you just have more babies, right? Perhaps I've had people in the group or people that I supported, they only had one baby and that baby died. They got pregnant one time, had that precious little one, and that baby died, and that was the only pregnancy they had. How do you reconcile, I can just go on to have another baby? Maybe not. What that does is it minimizes the life of the person that was near and dear to you, to say, well, at least they're not suffering anymore. And this lady in our group one time, and she was there because she had lost her mom. And I never thought about this until she brought it up in our group. And she said, people keep asking me how old my mom was. Now, she was younger, later child than the other kids in the family. And so she would say, I don't know, 84. Let's just grab a number. I know it was 80s. I don't recall the exact number. Oh, well, she lived a good life, didn't she? And she said, I would get so angry and I would say, really? Because I want to hear just one more moment. I want one more hug. I want one more I love you. Doesn't matter the age. What matters is this person that was important to me and the foundation of my life is no longer with me in the same way. And that hurts. So all these cliche things that people try to discover that are not at all helpful, well, you don't want to point at them and say, wow, you're really not at all helpful. So this was what I would say when people would say things to me that were sometimes hurtful. I would say, well, you would think that would be the case, but in fact, that is less helpful to me, but here is what is more helpful. Now, we don't always have the strength when we're grieving to do the educational moments, but I always say, if you can find an educational moment, take it, because people need to learn and they want to learn. They want to know what is helpful for you to get you through this. They just don't know how to do it. So like over on the table, there are some handouts that say what to do to help those who are grieving, or there's one that says what not to do for those who are grieving. So those are important. I mean, you wouldn't maybe take those because you say, well, I'm the griever. Take them and give them to your family. Take them and give them to your friends. Let them know that might be mine, but just ignore it. I thought I turned it off, but I don't think somebody's phone is ringing. Is that yours? Yeah, it's probably mine. We'll just ignore it. Sorry about that. I was sure I turned it off. It is. I turned it off. I was sure I did. I ignored it. Okay, thank you. Thank you. My apologies, everyone. I knew I turned it off. Huh?
Very soothing.
Yeah, I need something gentle. I have enough stress that I don't need to have a stressful ring. Okay, so yeah. So yes, because as I said, people want to help, they just don't know how. So if we can give them those opportunities, think about what you were like before you had your grief experience. Think about maybe I always point to this one situation where I was in the funeral line and I was saying to myself, I want to say this profound something that person is going to go, oh, that's going to make all the difference in the world. Thank you so much. Because not because I wanted to be the big shot, but because I just wanted to offer them care and support. I had no idea. I don't remember what it was now, but I just remember whatever it was really dumb. And so I now later, having the knowledge that and the experiences I have in the grief area, know that there is no one profound statement that's going to take anyone's pain away. The thing that is going to help those who are grieving is to listen, to validate the concerns, and to offer an ability to give them what they need. If it is that they need to talk, if it is that they need to cry, that maybe you're just sitting in silence, but you're in the moment remembering that person who has passed away. And maybe you're just sitting in silence, which for some of us is hard to do. But I can do it. It might be killing me inside, but I can do it because maybe the silence is what's really important. This inside, I'll tell you, one of the things we do with the program is we meet with couples one-on-one moreover than in a group setting, only because, of our percentage of Catholic in the community. When a death of a baby occurs, there usually isn't enough of the Catholic community to form a group. So more often than not, I'm meeting with couples that or it's one-on-one. I'm coming into their homes and it's just mom, dad, and me. Maybe the kids are mulling around in the room or in another room. And so we'll be talking, and maybe there's a time where nobody's saying anything. And I am an engaging person. I am a talkative person, but I can sense, and I think that's only because the Holy Spirit gives me a sense, shut up a moment. Don't say anything. And the longer I'm quiet, then that person will come up with something that maybe they wouldn't have said otherwise, because they're just processing it all. They're just realizing what they're dealing with. And then that silence gives us an ability to discover a new finding, a new revelation that maybe can help them. I will tell you, though, too, meeting with these couples over the years that I've had, there is a definite difference between how men and women grieve. We call those gender differences in grief. Definite difference. And you're not going to be surprised as I point out the differences, because women culturally probably have a greater permission to be emotional, to be expressive, to do whatever they need to do in order to purge the emotions that they're feeling as they're grieving. And then here's the man on the other side of it, who's expected to be the rock, the support, the one who holds everybody else up and takes care of everything, takes care of the wife, the children, whatever, because he's the strength of the family unit. But the misfortune of that is that men grieve just as women grieve. Now, some men don't have the same need to express their emotions. That's true. But I think if given an opportunity, they do. So I'll tell you about this one couple in particular that I met with several times, and their baby had died full term in stillbirth. And I would go to their home, and I try to keep it around an hour or so. And wife would talk and talk and talk. And dad kept having this revelation that it's my job as a father to get my child to heaven. And my child's in heaven now. So, hey, I'm okay with this because that's my duty as a father. And that's been accomplished. So God's will be done. And the mom, on the other hand, is over here really emotional and expressive and very needy in terms of the support that she's trying to seek from this dad, right? So I would come and I would ask open-ended questions that brought about discussion. And as the hour would go along, every once in a while, he would say, really? I never knew you felt that way. And inside I'm going, yes. And then she would say something else and he'd go, oh, I didn't know that. And as time went on, he began to open up his mind to what it was that she was experiencing. And then there were areas of which he then was experiencing. And the more he was able to talk about it with her, And I became kind of the secondary person in the room because all I was doing was asking the questions that evoked the discussion. Then they started to come together. Because you know what? Statistically, marriages will fail after the death of a child more often than not. It's a high, now for Catholics, it's less, but it's a high statistics that divorce happens to those who have lost a child because of the stress that ensues from the death of a child. So, we have to be mindful of that and help people to know communication is key to any relationship. Well, but now you've added the mix of the stress of grief to it. And if you don't have communication going, then you're going to have some real challenges coming your way. That can be in a marriage, that can be with siblings, parents. I don't care what your relationship, work relationships, whatever it is, there needs to be communication happening so everyone feels as though their needs and their concerns are being met. So know your limitations and feel as though you're comfortable with whatever you decide to do for the holidays, whatever you want to do. And I say that emphasis because we will just often go along with what people expect for us, right? This is your grief experience. This is what you need to do in order to deal with it. And so it's important that you express things in your own way, that you do things in your own way, regardless of what people think. So I have another story to tell you that is kind of a little out there, but it emphasizes my point. So it's been a number of years ago, and a priest calls me and says, hey, I had this parish family suffered the loss of their baby. They wanted to have the funeral at the funeral home. So I went, I did a little service at the funeral home, and we're getting ready to leave to go to the cemetery, and it's raining. And so the dad is carrying the casket, which is a little tiny casket, takes the lid off of the casket, starts walking around in the rain. And he says, that was the most peculiar thing I ever saw, and I have no idea what to do with that. So I felt the same way when he was telling me it. But fortunately, our program has a family therapist who works with me in the group. And so having that professional opportunity, I call the therapist up and I say, hey, here's this. I'm going to go see this couple. What do I do with this? And she said, well, my first thought is, what was the mom doing while the dad was taking the baby through the rain, with the corpse? And what was she doing? And I don't know. Well, that's what you got to find out, because what's important is, how's she doing with this? Is she okay with it? So I get there, and they had a little toddler. Toddler was being very fussy, and one of the things that they would do to bring down this toddler's fussiness would put him in the car and drive around, which is common for little ones, right? So as I'm getting there, dad's loading up the toddler in the car to go take a ride to calm him down and get him a little bit, out of the fussy stage. So as I'm talking to her, one of the first things I do is tell me what happened. We're talking about all the experiences, and we get to the funeral. And the subject comes up about, what did you do for the funeral? And she brought it up. And I said, what did you think about that? Oh, I thought it was wonderful. She said, we'll never have the experience of a rain storm or a rain, with our child. And that was a gift. As we were leaving, that rain came down, and that was an experience that we could have that we would not maybe normally have. And I'm like, okay, she's good with it. Now, do we look at this and think it's a bit strange and maybe something we wouldn't do? Doesn't matter. It was comforting to them. It was important to them. And that's why I stress that whatever is important to you, whatever needs you might have through this holiday season to get you, I don't want to say to get you through it. I was going to say to get you through it. I want to say that gives you the best experience that you can hope for in the circumstances that you're in, then that's what you have to do, regardless of what anybody on the outside looking in is thinking or trying to convince you to do. We had a lady in our group one time, she literally just went off by herself and took a trip, and her family went crazy. You can't do that. That's what she wanted to do. And in the end, she was happy she did it. It's okay. Do what you need to do in order to help you through it. And don't worry about it. It's just like we talk about in the groups all the time. Don't get rid of your loved one's belongings until you're ready to do it. Somebody says, get rid of them right away. They're just a reminder. No, if that's not what you want to do, don't do that. You have to do what works best for you. But I will say, getting outside yourself is something that can be important to do. So as you're coming up on the holidays, maybe you think about not necessarily Christmas Day, but perhaps in the Christmas season, maybe you make a plate of cookies and take them to your neighbor. Maybe you go down to Matt Talbot and volunteer for a meal or something, something that gets you outside of yourself. Because when we're grieving, we can feel so isolated and so overwhelmed that that's all we're living is our grief. But if we force ourselves to kind of get outside of ourselves and find something that helps somebody else, then it can perhaps lift us even for a moment out of that overwhelming feeling that we sometimes have when we're going through this experience. So just moving outside of that. The last thing I'll say is the intensity that we feel when we're grieving, the life-changing experience that we're going through can sometimes feel so overwhelming that we could lose hope. But we could say, this is never going to be better again. But what I will assure you of is that this will not remain with you forever. The intensity of this will not remain with you forever. For the rest of your life, you will be different, but it won't be this intense. So I'll give you another little story to kind of emphasize my point. So I lost my brother to suicide. He was probably my closest sibling out of the six of us. And he had some mental health issues, and, uneducated we were on the issue of suicide. When he would speak about committing suicide, everybody just thought he was just trying to get attention. And I just thought, there's no way he'd have the courage to do suicide. I think he can't be serious. And he did. Not only did he commit suicide, but he hung himself. And I still am haunted by what that experience might have been, he being alone, hanging to his death. Haunts me still. But this was several years after he died. This was 25 years ago. And I'm driving somewhere. And this is where I said earlier about how we have these experiences that are totally unexpected. We think we're going along and maybe we're doing okay. And then something hits us like a Mack truck and causes us to go, whoa. The reality is he's no longer here, right? So I'm sitting at a stop sign. There's a car in front of me and waiting for the person ahead of me to go. And as the gentleman that's in front of me turns to look for a car, I literally gasp. And I say, that's my brother's profile. It was totally my brother sitting in that car. The profile was so reminiscent. And I began to cry. But I wasn't crying out of the loss of him. I wasn't crying because he was dead. The tears came from gratefulness. Because for that moment, after all those years that he had been gone, that experience gave me the ability to remember him that day, to remember how important he was to me, what value that I had for him. Yes, that I missed him, but how much I loved him. So while it is life-changing as we go through grief, and that maybe we will never be the same person again in the same way, God gives us those little nuggets that kind of help us get through it, right? And it was a different kind of tear. It was a different kind of memory. It was a different experience altogether. Because as we know, as faithful Catholics, we are not walking this path alone. We are walking with the Lord. He is holding us up. He has all of his infinite mercy to give us as we grieve. And no matter who is in our life or who makes us feel isolated or who doesn't attend to our needs, we always have that gift of our faith. We have the gift of the Eucharist. We have the gift of each other as faithful Catholics that sustain us through this. And there's always someone in our faith that will help you if you just simply reach out. So that's all I have. Unless you have questions in the comments to bring about more discussion.